Hello everyone, this is Bentley. Today is going to be one of those more philosophical videos. And let me give you some context as to why I'm going to talk about what I'm talking about. The start of the pandemic, and even a little bit before then, we were seeing several changes in our hobby. Certain things were becoming harder to get or more expensive, price increases, all your usual economic stuff as time goes by. However, the pandemic really affected this. We saw fish prices get to significantly higher levels than we probably ever saw before. I mean, my best example is I can remember when autosinkless of $3 fish were $8 a piece and almost impossible to get a hold of. Now, some of this has come back down, but is it necessarily a bad thing that prices get more expensive? Let me explain what I'm talking about. In the freshwater hobby especially, because we don't typically see this in saltwater, there is a heavy focus on trying to do things low budget, low tech, low. I want to be very clear. I am certainly not bashing people who go for a more economically friendly tank. You know, they're using dirt as a substrate. They're getting plants from friends or some really easy plants that propagate quickly, like just a little bit of Alisteria and letting it do its work. You're using a simple light or maybe only ambient lighting through your windows, whatever it may be. Sponge filter only because it makes your equipment cost significantly less, right? There's nothing wrong with being a little fiscally savvy. But if we look at our hobby in some of the other countries in this world, it's way different. Europe, Germany especially, where the Germans take this to a crazy level, we start seeing almost all like rimless style tanks and all this high level equipment, much more expensive, and not necessarily just in aquascaping. We start seeing better filtration options out there, whether more people are using canister filters instead of necessarily sponges, or just a focus on quality. In Japan, for example, if you go to a local fish store, almost all of them are like your more aquascaping style shops if they're not a koi farm. You start to see more and more of this in Europe especially, and we're even starting to see this in parts of South America where there is becoming more and more of a focus on these very nice, more elegant solutions instead of your atypical dollar per gallon sale Aqueon tank and the cheapest XYZ we can find because we're trying to put together tank number 345 or whatever it may be, right? Lots of us in the United States have multiple tank syndrome, and often we'll cut some corners to do things faster. Now, what I would argue is that as prices have hit all sorts of increases, whether it's from inflation, whether it's from supply chain requirements and changes because of the pandemic, whatever it may be, this might not necessarily be a bad thing because it might change some of our mentality to look at instead of what XYZ cheap thing is going to do really, really fast. Instead going, you know what, I'm going to wait longer and make something nicer because it's going to cost me more money anyway. I'm not trying to say that like you have to buy the most expensive light and you have to buy only rimless tanks or only custom built acrylic or only all this crazy stuff, right? But more that instead of buying one sponge filter and the cheapest air pump we can get, maybe we get something slightly nicer. Maybe it's 2 sponge filters, right? Maybe it's a slightly nicer sponge filter. And I put that in big quotation marks because it's a sponge. Right? But for some people, they might perceive one particular type of sponge as slightly better than another. Or maybe it's just the thought of quantity and getting a nicer air pump to drive those things. Or maybe it's looking at a slightly more expensive heating solution because you're doing multiple small heaters in a bigger tank like this one behind me instead of relying on only one. Maybe it is branching all the way out for that expensive canister filter because you want a really, really nice filtration system, but you're also supplementing with something like a sponge filter, much like you can see behind me here, right? I've got a canister on this side, sponge over here. There's lots of ways that we can do this, but more importantly, what I want to say from a philosophical standpoint is we have this huge focus on trying to do the most economically friendly tank, but then we're willing very often to spend almost any amount of money on medicine or this or additives or that or whatever the newest, hottest food may be for our fish. But the actual environment they're living in, that's where we try to save all of our money. Maybe we might be better off being a little more patient. I know it's hard, believe me. Believe me, I'm very impatient when it comes to setting up a tank. And most of the tanks around my house, you guys have seen the fish room tours, were not done in the smartest way possible. And I like to learn from my mistakes. So that's part of why I'm talking to you about this today. Maybe if we take that extra time, plan everything out, spend a little bit more money on what we use to create the ecosystem for our fish, we'll be less likely to run into disease problems or worrying that, like, maybe that's not the right food because this fish doesn't go to it within a second, or they're not fat enough, or whatever it may be that you think makes you need to change something that's going on in your environment instead of just providing a better basic set of circumstances in the first place. I'm going to, as many of you who've watched my live streams now, will argue the other side, because I think it's important in these philosophical type conversations that we be unbiased in our thinking and be willing to listen to both sides of the argument. So, from that perspective, let us talk about being economically friendly in our tanks. Is $1 per gallon sale tank bad? No, not at all. Are you going to get a leaker every once in a while or something wrong with it every once in a while? Yeah, when they're being mass produced, that happens. But occasionally you get those problems in some of your nicer end tanks too. Not as frequently, and keep in mind frequently means like 1% of the time. It's tiny. But is there anything wrong with having that kind of tank? Not at all. Is there anything wrong with using sponge filtration? Not at all. Is there anything wrong with trying to save money on a light because you don't need something too crazy? Maybe you're not doing a very densely planted tank, or maybe the only plants you're using are things like Java Fern and Anubias and all the low light demand plants. So you don't necessarily need a Fluval 3.0 or a Chihiro's Vivid or some really crazy expensive light. That's okay. But let's make sure that when we're planning those things, we're not making those decisions purely on cost. We're making those decisions because they're the right decision for the environment we're creating for our fish. That's the core of the argument. It is perfectly fine if you have like axolotls who don't like super bright light to get a less expensive, dimmer light. That's perfectly okay. Go look at something like the Higer. Go look at something like a JCMP where you can dim it down quite a bit and it's not going to cost you nearly as much. Perfectly okay. Don't need a heater? Perfect. That saves you some money, right? Want to run based on air filtration? Okay, but consider maybe putting multiple sponges or larger sponges in your tank than what is the minimum, or what is considered like, yeah, this is the right sponge. Maybe go for something a little bit bigger. I very frequently champion like a larger hang-on back than what is suggested for a tank. So like a 40-gallon breeder, I'll put something like a Tidal or AquaClear 70-75 on there, or even bigger. I'll go all the way to the 110s because I want that extra capacity, and the ability to control my flow rate lets me set it down or go all the way because I want to make sure that I have that good throughput. I think we can do the same thing even when we're trying to be a little more economical. Is it going to really kill us to spend the extra $20 for a secondary sponge filter to make sure that we get slightly better filtration overall and a slightly better environment for our fish? I don't think so. Will we have to buy a slightly nicer air pump to power 2 instead of 1? Yeah, but the difference might only cost us $10. It's not like I'm talking about you need to spend several hundred or even $1,000 more like it is in the case of, say, saltwater tanks very frequently, but more, don't go purely on save as much money as possible in the environment, and then later, especially if you're a softie like me, know that you're going to do anything you can to keep your fish alive if it comes to medication or things like that should a problem arise. well, maybe we should just instead invest that money up front, provide that better environment, and we might not have those problems in the very first place. That's it. Little philosophical. What I really want to hear from you guys, comments down below. Let me know. Has the pandemic changed the way that you look at your fish tanks? Is it a matter of I've got to be pickier about the fish I buy, or maybe like I don't buy as many fish, or maybe I'm really careful and I pick only the specific fish I know I really want. I don't try like a couple of this and a couple of that. I pick just this group. Or maybe it's something like, because of the pandemic, I started looking at a fish I normally wouldn't have looked at because that fish happened to be in a better price range for me, and that was my way to save some money. Equipment, whatever it may be. Let me know in the comments down below. I really want to hear from you guys, your thoughts on this kind of subject. Should we start changing our thinking, especially in the United States when it comes to the hobby, and focus on a little bit more quality over necessarily getting the best possible deal? If you enjoyed this video, please give it a little like, maybe share it. If you're not subscribed, consider becoming a subscriber, ring the bell, all the usual YouTube beggar things that make the algorithm very happy and help out your local, friendly, small YouTuber. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and stay awesome.